The Ethiopian Bible, preserved in its original integrity by Ethiopian Orthodox monks, contains accounts that were systematically omitted or distorted by Western canons. Accounts that speak of flying machines, celestial chariots, and technologies that challenge our conventional understanding of antiquity. King Solomon, an emblematic figure of divine wisdom, emerges in these sacred pages not just as a wise ruler, but as the possessor of technological knowledge that transcended the limits of what we consider possible for that era. While the biblical texts approved by Roman authority limit themselves to a generic mention of his wisdom and riches, the Ethiopian manuscripts preserve detailed descriptions of devices that flew through the skies, built with unknown metals and powered by forces the ancients described as divine, but which may have simply been advanced science misunderstood by later generations. The question that inevitably arises is, why were these accounts deliberately excluded from the texts that reached us through the official channels of Christianity? The answer lies in the very nature of institutionalized religious power, which has always feared knowledge that might question its authority or reveal inconvenient truths about human capabilities when in direct connection with the divine. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia is not accidental. It represents the resistance of a people who never completely submitted to the interpretations imposed by Rome, keeping alive a tradition that connects us directly to the original sources of sacred knowledge. The Ethiopian monks, silent guardians of this ancestral wisdom, perpetuated through the millennia a version of history that the Western religious hierarchy deemed too dangerous to disseminate. These holy men, isolated in monasteries built in almost inaccessible locations, maintained intact the texts that describe not only Solomon's flying machines, but an entire system of knowledge that integrated spirituality with technological advances that we would today consider impossible for that time. Their libraries, protected through centuries of invasions and attempts at suppression, contain diagrams, technical descriptions, and eyewitness accounts that paint a radically different picture of antiquity. The connection between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, as preserved in the Ethiopian texts, is revealed to be much deeper than a simple diplomatic visit. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian sacred chronicle of the 14th century, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, not only visited Solomon in Jerusalem, but actively participated in the development and operation of these extraordinary technologies. She was not merely a spectator of Solomonic wisdom, she was a collaborator, an initiate into the mysteries that allowed the Hebrew king to exercise dominion not only over the earth, but also over the heavens. This partnership resulted not only in the birth of Menelik, who would go on to found the Ethiopian dynasty, but also in the transfer of technological knowledge that would be preserved in the mountains of East Africa while disappearing from the rest of the world. The conventional narrative has been presented to us in a way that minimizes the importance of Africa in the history of human knowledge. But the Ethiopian texts reveal a very different reality. They show that Solomon's wisdom was not an isolated gift, but part of a network of knowledge that spanned the entire ancient world, connecting civilizations through technologies that we would today classify as impossible. The flying machines were not the exclusive privilege of Jerusalem. They were part of a global system of communication and transport that linked the great centers of power and wisdom of antiquity, a system of which Ethiopia was not only a participant, but a privileged guardian. The monumental architecture found in both Jerusalem and Ethiopia offers tangible clues about these lost technologies. Solomon's first temple, as described in biblical texts, was built with stones of impossible dimensions, cut with a precision that defies our understanding of the tools available at the time. But it is the Ethiopian texts that provide us with the key to understanding how such a feat was possible. The descriptions of the flying machines include accounts of how these devices were used not only for transport, but also for handling heavy materials, allowing for constructions that would otherwise be impossible with the technology conventionally attributed to that period. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela represent an even deeper mystery. These structures, carved from the top down into volcanic basalt, exhibit an architectural precision and complexity that baffles modern experts. The local tradition, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox priests, asserts that these churches were built in a single night with the help of flying assistants, a description that Western scholars prefer to interpret as an angelic metaphor, but which the Ethiopian texts describe in surprisingly technical terms. These descriptions speak of intense lights that illuminated the nocturnal work, of tools that cut rock as if it were clay, and of devices that removed debris through the air. The Book of Enoch, preserved in its entirety only by the Ethiopian tradition, offers even more specific descriptions of these technologies. While other branches of Christianity relegated this text to apocryphal status, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained it as an integral part of its sacred canon. The reasons for this preservation become clear when we examine the content. The book contains detailed descriptions of watchers who descended from the heavens in shining ships, teaching humanity not only metallurgy and astronomy, but also the arts of construction and flight. These are not vague descriptions of divine intervention. They contain technical specifics that suggest real knowledge of advanced engineering principles. The issue of the selective preservation of these texts reveals much about the dynamics of power in the history of Christianity. While Roman and later European authorities edited, censored, and reinterpreted the sacred texts according to their political and theological needs, Ethiopia remained a bastion of intellectual and spiritual independence. This resistance was not merely political, it was a conscious defense of knowledge that Ethiopian leaders recognized as fundamental to the true understanding of humanity's spiritual heritage. They understood that allowing the alteration or suppression of these texts would mean the irreversible loss of information that could be crucial for the future of humanity. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition, written in Ge'ez characters, preserved not only the words but also diagrams and illustrations that accompany the descriptions of the flying machines. These drawings, kept secret in monastic libraries, show devices curiously similar in shape to modern concepts of aircraft, with structures that combine organic and mechanical elements in a way that suggests a profound understanding of the principles of flight. The monks responsible for their preservation developed elaborate coding systems to protect this information from unauthorized eyes, creating layers of meaning that can only be deciphered by initiates in the tradition. The metallurgy described in these texts also deserves special attention. Solomon's flying machines were built with metal alloys that the texts describe as incorruptible and lighter than bronze, but stronger than iron. Recent archaeological discoveries in the Aksum region have revealed metallic artifacts that correspond to these descriptions, objects whose chemical composition suggests knowledge of metallurgy that should not exist in that period, according to our conventional chronology. The presence of these materials in Ethiopia, far from the traditional centers of ancient metallurgy, suggests that technological knowledge was much more widely distributed than we assume, or that systems of communication and transport existed that allowed for the rapid dissemination of technical innovations. The Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, which governed the country until the 20th century, kept alive not only the claim of direct descent from Solomon and Makeda, but also the tradition that this lineage carried the legacy of the great king's technological knowledge. This was not merely a political claim intended to legitimize power, it was the conscious preservation of a technical tradition that the Ethiopian emperors considered their sacred responsibility to maintain and protect. The coronation rituals of the Ethiopian emperors included secret ceremonies in which the new rulers were initiated into ancestral knowledge that included not only spiritual wisdom but also technical principles preserved since the time of Solomon. Ethiopian royal iconography is replete with symbols that, when carefully examined, reveal consistent representations of flying objects. The murals in the imperial palaces, the illuminations in the sacred manuscripts, and even the crown jewels contain recurring motifs of winged solar discs, ascending spirals, and rays of light emanating from celestial vehicles. These are not abstract symbols of divinity. They are iconographic representations of specific technologies, preserved in the Ethiopian cultural memory through art when verbal description became too dangerous to be maintained in explicit form. The monasteries of Lake Tana, true repositories of Ethiopian wisdom, still maintain manuscripts today that describe in technical detail the operation of these ancestral machines. The monks who have access to these texts speak cautiously of secrets that are not for the curious but only for the righteous. a phrase that reveals both the existence of hidden knowledge and the prudence with which it is guarded. These holy men understand that they are protecting information that could transform our understanding of human history. But they also recognize the inherent dangers in the premature disclosure of knowledge that humanity may not yet be prepared to use wisely. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia during the Mussolini regime represents a particularly dark chapter in the history of the preservation of this knowledge. The invaders, aware of the historical and possibly technological value of the Ethiopian manuscripts, undertook a systematic looting of the monastic libraries. Unofficial accounts, later suppressed or discredited, speak of the discovery of scrolls containing technical diagrams and descriptions of machines that Italian scholars could not fully comprehend, but recognized as extraordinarily advanced for their supposed time of origin. Many of these documents disappeared into the private vaults of collectors or the secret collections of the Vatican, where they remain inaccessible to independent researchers. The Ethiopian resistance to this plundering was not just a matter of national pride. It was the recognition that they were defending a heritage that belonged not only to Ethiopia, but to humanity as a whole. The monks developed elaborate systems to hide the most important manuscripts, creating convincing forgeries to satisfy the looters while preserving the originals in hideouts, known only to extremely restricted inner circles. This tradition of protection continues to this day, with many of the most important texts remaining hidden, even from sympathetic researchers, awaiting a time when humanity demonstrates greater wisdom in its pursuit of knowledge. The technical language preserved in these manuscripts offers fascinating insights into how the ancients understood and described principles that we today recognize as fundamental to physics and engineering. The descriptions of the flying machines include references to fire that does not burn, wind that pushes without blowing, and metals that dance with the stars, terminology that, when carefully analyzed, suggests knowledge of principles such as jet propulsion, electromagnetism, and possibly even the weak nuclear force. This was not the language of primitives imagining the impossible. It was the language of technically sophisticated people describing realities that their culture had developed means of creating and controlling. The comparison between Ethiopian texts and other ancient traditions reveals patterns that suggest the existence of a global network of technological knowledge in antiquity. The descriptions of the Vimanas in the Sanskrit epics of India, the Egyptian accounts of solar boats sailing through the heavens, and the Mayan representations of objects that surprisingly resemble modern aircraft all find notable echoes in the Ethiopian descriptions of Solomon's machines. This convergence cannot be adequately explained by coincidence or the universal human tendency to dream of flight. The technical specificities are too consistent and detailed to be the product of collective imagination. What makes the Ethiopian preservation especially valuable is the uninterrupted continuity of its manuscript tradition. While other cultures saw their technical knowledge fragmented by conquests, forced conversions, and systematic destruction of texts, Ethiopia maintained an unbroken chain of transmission that connects contemporary texts directly to the original sources. This continuity allowed for the preservation not only of the basic descriptions of the technologies, but also of the cultural and spiritual contexts that gave meaning to this knowledge, offering a much more complete view than simply disconnected fragments found in other traditions. The integration between spirituality and technology, as presented in the Ethiopian texts, offers a radically different perspective on the relationship between science and faith. Contrary to the modern dichotomy that views these areas as fundamentally incompatible, the ancient Ethiopians preserved a holistic view in which technological mastery was inseparable from spiritual development. Solomon's flying machines were not simply mechanical devices, they were physical manifestations of elevated spiritual principles, tools that could only be operated by those who had achieved a certain level of purity and spiritual understanding. This perspective offers profound insights into why this knowledge was eventually lost. It was not simply a matter of civilizational decline or accidental loss of information. It was the result of the gradual degradation of the spiritual understanding necessary to utilize these technologies safely and beneficially. The Ethiopian texts contain explicit warnings about the dangers of separating technological power from spiritual wisdom, prophetic descriptions of how the improper use of this knowledge could lead to mass destruction and social chaos. The selective preservation of these texts by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church reflects a profound understanding of this relationship between power and responsibility. Ethiopian religious leaders were not simply guarding historical information, they were protecting knowledge that could be dangerous if applied without adequate spiritual preparation. This was not religious obscurantism, but a form of cosmic responsibility, the recognition that certain truths can only be revealed when humanity demonstrates that it is prepared to use them constructively. The technical descriptions preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts include not only the specifications of the machines themselves, but also the training and preparation processes required to operate them. These processes combined physical discipline, mental purification, and spiritual elevation in a way that suggests a deep understanding of the interconnection between consciousness and technological control. The operators of these machines were not simply pilots or technicians, they were priest engineers who had dedicated decades to mastering not only the mechanical principles, but also the spiritual dimensions of their art. The Ethiopian tradition also preserves detailed accounts of the consequences of the loss of this knowledge. According to these texts, the decline in the ability to build and operate the flying machines was not gradual, but sudden and catastrophic, a direct result of internal conflicts that led to the profanation of the sacred sites where the knowledge was preserved and transmitted. This narrative offers an alternative perspective on the collapse of various ancient civilizations, suggesting that many of them possessed much more advanced technological capabilities than we currently recognize, capabilities that were lost when the societies that created them lost the spiritual cohesion necessary to sustain them. The sacred geography of Ethiopia reveals patterns that support the technical descriptions found in the ancient manuscripts. The locations chosen for the construction of monasteries and churches do not only follow spiritual or defensive criteria, they demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of geological and geomagnetic principles that would be essential for the operation of the technologies described in the texts. Many of these sites are situated on rock formations with unusual electromagnetic properties, at altitudes that would offer specific advantages for the takeoff and landing of aircraft, and near mineral deposits that correspond to the materials mentioned in the descriptions of the flying machines. Modern analysis of these sites reveals features that could not have been identified by conventional methods available at the time of their selection. The astronomical precision with which many Ethiopian temples were oriented, the incorporation of specific geological features into their designs, and the presence of local magnetic anomalies suggest that the ancient builders possessed measuring instruments and scientific knowledge much more advanced than conventional history leads us to believe. This physical evidence offers tangible support for the textual descriptions of the technological capabilities preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts. The monasteries themselves function as living libraries of this ancient knowledge. Their libraries contain not only written texts, but also three-dimensional models, measuring instruments and devices whose purpose the monks admit they do not fully understand, but which they carefully preserve because they recognize their historical importance. Some of these objects exhibit physical properties that defy explanation using conventional principles, including materials that appear to be older than the surrounding natural minerals and devices that generate weak but measurable magnetic fields even when apparently inactive. The oral tradition preserved by the Ethiopian monks complements the written texts with details that were never entrusted to parchment. This oral tradition includes not only more detailed technical descriptions, but also the specific historical reasons for the decision to keep this knowledge secret. According to these traditions, the decision to hide the technological knowledge was not made by the Ethiopians themselves, but was a direct instruction from the last competent operators of the flying machines, who foresaw that humanity would go through a period of spiritual darkness during which this knowledge would inevitably be misused if it remained available. The depth of this oral tradition is demonstrated by the extraordinary consistency of the accounts preserved in monasteries separated by hundreds of kilometers and which maintained minimal contact for centuries. The same technical details, the same spiritual warnings, and the same descriptions of the transition periods appear in traditions that were transmitted independently, suggesting that they all derive from common, extremely ancient, and precise sources. This consistency offers additional validation of the historical authenticity of the knowledge preserved in the written texts. The hierarchical structure of the preservation of this knowledge in the Ethiopian tradition reflects a sophisticated understanding of the principles of information security. Different levels of initiation have access to different aspects of the preserved knowledge, with the most technical and potentially dangerous details being entrusted only to those who have demonstrated not only intellectual competence, but also spiritual maturity and a commitment to the welfare of humanity. This system of layered protection ensured that critical information was preserved, even during periods of external persecution or internal conflict, as no single individual or small group possessed enough knowledge to compromise the entire system. The correspondence between the Ethiopian descriptions and archaeological discoveries in other parts of the world offers additional validation of the historical accuracy of these texts. Artifacts discovered in sites associated with ancient civilizations frequently exhibit technical characteristics that make little sense in their conventional historical contexts, but which align perfectly with the descriptions found in the Ethiopian manuscripts. This convergence between textual and archaeological evidence suggests that the knowledge preserved in Ethiopia is not isolated fantasy, but fragments of a much broader and technologically sophisticated historical reality than our current understanding of antiquity allows us to recognize. The contemporary relevance of the knowledge preserved in the Ethiopian texts transcends purely historical interest. As our own civilization develops advanced flight technologies, artificial intelligence, and energy manipulation on increasingly larger scales, the warnings and principles preserved in these ancient manuscripts acquire prophetic urgency. The descriptions of the social and spiritual consequences of the inappropriate use of advanced technologies offer valuable perspectives on the challenges our own era faces in dealing with powers that can easily surpass our collective wisdom to control them beneficially. The Ethiopian approach to the preservation of dangerous knowledge offers an alternative model to the modern dilemma regarding the disclosure of potentially destructive scientific discoveries. Instead of the simplistic dichotomy between complete revelation and total suppression, the Ethiopian tradition developed a sophisticated system of gradual revelation based on the preparation and maturity of the recipient. This model recognizes that knowledge itself is neither good nor bad, but that its application depends crucially on the spiritual and ethical context of those who use it. The technical descriptions preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts also offer insights that could be relevant to contemporary technological challenges. Principles of propulsion based on the manipulation of gravitational fields, methods of construction that utilize resonant properties of specific materials, and control systems that integrate biological response with artificial mechanisms. All these approaches find echoes at the most advanced frontiers of modern scientific research. The possibility that the ancients developed solutions to problems we are still trying to solve should motivate a more serious study of these texts by the contemporary scientific community. The spiritual dimension of technological knowledge, as preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, offers crucial perspectives on the responsible integration of advanced capabilities into human societies. The ancient descriptions suggest that truly transformative technologies can only be used sustainably by societies that have developed corresponding spiritual and ethical maturity. This perspective offers a valuable frame of reference for assessing our own technological development and identifying areas where greater spiritual and ethical preparation may be necessary before implementing potentially disruptive capabilities. The continuous preservation of this knowledge by the Ethiopian monks represents an act of faith not only in relation to the past, but also in relation to the future. They keep these traditions alive in the expectation that a time will come when humanity will be sufficiently mature to receive and wisely use the knowledge that their ancestors considered too dangerous to reveal. This long-term perspective offers a striking contrast to the short-term orientation that characterizes much of contemporary technological development, suggesting that some of the most important decisions about technology may require time horizons that exceed normal cycles of commercial or political development. The final question that emerges from the study of these texts is whether our own era is approaching the level of spiritual and ethical maturity necessary to receive fuller revelations of the preserved knowledge. The signs are mixed. On the one hand, we have developed technological capabilities that approach those described in the ancient texts. On the other hand, our application of these capabilities often demonstrates a lack of the wisdom and responsibility that the texts identify as essential prerequisites. The answer to this question may determine whether the contemporary guardians of this knowledge decide to maintain their traditional silence or begin the gradual revelation that could transform our understanding of both the past and the future possibilities of humanity. The legacy of Solomon's flying machines, preserved in the silent mountains of Ethiopia, continues to challenge our assumptions about the limits of human knowledge and the relationship between technological progress and spiritual development. In the pages guarded by the Ethiopian Orthodox monks, we find not only descriptions of ancient wonders, but also a map for navigating the challenges of our own technological era. The wisdom preserved in these sacred texts whispers across the centuries, offering both inspiration and warning to a species that once again finds itself on the threshold of capabilities that could elevate it to the heights or precipitate its downfall. The choice, as always, remains ours.